Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got another Tavour review, and this is two different brewers, but a single style. And we are returning yet again to Oktoberfest, commonly known as Oktoberfest. It's Märzen style beers. Yet again, we are taking a look at two different American craft interpretations of the Märzen style. While I appreciate this video will be showing probably May, June of 2020, I record months in advance to make sure I don't get behind on my content. So these are actually fresh beers for me. But I'm hoping this review will give you some ideas of stuff to log away for a couple months down the line when 2020 Oktoberfest season rolls around. Assuming these will come back out and give you an idea if there's some that you might want to try to pick up. Nonetheless, today we are going to be starting with a collaborative brew. This is between Matchless Brewing and collaboration with Geaux. That's French spelling G-E-A-U-X. This beer is called These Pretzels Are Making Me Thirsty. Again, this is a Märzen or Oktoberfest style beer. This one clocks in at 5.6% ABV. And Matchless, who is the main brewer on here, they are based out of Tumwater, Washington State. Beer number two. This is Connecticut Valley Brewing Company's Oktoberfest, spelled with a K as it should be. Again, this is a Märzen or Oktoberfest style beer. 5.8% ABV on this one, so slightly higher than the prior. And they are based out of South Windsor, Connecticut. So, two different sides of the country, completely different coasts. One's a collab, one's just by their own hand. Both similar ABVs, American interpretations of a classic Munich, Bavaria, German beer style that everybody loves. So I'm always interested to see how the American interpretations come out. If they're going to be more malty, if they're going to be more hoppy and more akin to the traditional German brewed Oktoberfest Märzen style beers, or somewhere in between. So it's always a treat. I can't wait to jump right in. So we're going to do exactly that. Starting with the collaboration that Matchless did with Geaux. This is These Pretzels Are Making Me Thirsty. Märzen style beer clocking in at 5.6% ABV. Okay, now jumping into our first beer of today's Tavour single style, different brewer review. We've got Matchless collaborative brew with Geaux Brewing Company. These Pretzels Are Making Me Thirsty. This is a Märzen or Oktoberfest, as is more commonly known, style beer. 5.6% ABV on this one. Matchless is based out of Tumwater, Washington State. So in terms of label art, it's got a very much classic Oktoberfest theme, kind of blue, light blue, sky blue, and diamond checkered pattern with a big fat German pretzel there. So not much goes better with Oktoberfest and beer celebrations than those German pretzels. They are delicious. Let's get this one cracked. Being gentle, great. It's been a while since I've had one of my canned beers get away from me. I think I'm getting better at it, folks. All right, let's get this poured. Oh, that's a beautiful looking beer. See, this falls somewhere in between the average American appearance and an actual German appearance. They're much lighter and much less caramel added, and this kind of seems to be splitting the difference. So I've got high hopes for this one. I think this might be a nice even keel, split the difference between the two classic interpretations of the style. Yeah, visually that's a beautiful beer. I mean, it's just stunning. It's got a nice mix of very fine small champagne-like bubbles and slightly medium-sized, slightly larger, not much larger, but slightly. Formed a pretty good head on top though. It's not super lush. I don't think it's going to hold that great, but it looks pretty good in the here and now. So let's give this a sniff. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, so this does indeed kind of smell as I thought it might come off just looking at it. It's got a little malty back, but it's definitely got a more classic German quality to it, a little German undertone. You can smell the hops in tandem with just that very classic German Märzen style malt bill. So it does smell like it's going to be a bit more hop forward than the average American interpretation. So let's jump right in and find out if we're right. Looks great. Let's do it. Oh yeah, there's a Märzen for you. Okay, so this is pretty much exactly what I thought it was going to be. This really does kind of split the difference between the vast majority of the American interpretations and how the Germans actually brew. I've talked about this in multiple different videos. The beers that are exported from Germany over here as Oktoberfest Märzen style beers are different beers by and large from most of the major German brewers than what they actually brew for themselves at the festival. At the festival, they're much lighter in appearance. They're a lot more hop dominant. It's almost like a bigger, heavier Pilsner that's maybe just a little bit less hoppy. It's a heavier beer, it's more malt centric, but it is the lighter malts that still lets the hops come through and lets the bitters come through. This kind of splits the difference. This has real substance and real presence to it, and it's got a nice kind of American twist, a malt bill to it, but it does very much have the classic flavor profile of the German Märzens. This definitely has a bit more hop presence than the average American interpretation, but it's not as hoppy as its German counterparts. So this falls squarely in the middle. This is a very good, accessible beer that's pretty much true to the style, though still kind of hanging out in this American craft interpretation of the style. I really like this. This is a very nice beer. This would be ridiculously enjoyable with a nice German hot pretzel, those soft, salty pretzels. This would quench the thirst and pair with it beautifully. Just the flavor, the way it comes about, it's fantastic. I'm going to jump in for body mouthfeel and start to explore these flavors. Body, this is on the high end of medium actually. It's surprisingly big and robust for the ABV. That's not a bad thing at all. It's got real presence in the mouth. Mouthfeel wise, it's kind of a medium light until you start to agitate it around the palate, and then it gets insanely creamy and it really thickens up and it feels quite robust in the mouth. Moving around the palate, it just gets ridiculously creamy and thick. In terms of flavor, it's nice and crisp as you'd expect from a Märzen, and I really appreciate that about it. I mean, this is just a beer that feels like it would be perfectly at home in Munich or München, if you prefer the German, as I do, right in the middle of the Oktoberfest festival. I mean, this is just a fantastic beer. This is very well done. I'm going to jump in one more time to pinpoint exactly how these flavors develop. It's got a lot going on here. Get it in your mouth immediately, you get that malty sweetness. There's only the slightest hint of a caramel, but then it gets to that classic German malt bill, exactly how they brew the Märzen. And the hops come through right in the middle, almost immediately behind the sweetness, and they pair just perfectly with the malt bill, but it's those classic German noble hops. It's nothing over the top, and they didn't overly hop it, so it doesn't have quite that same classic German hop bite, but you can tell they're there, and it balances out the sweetness and kind of holds pretty steadily. And then it's the decline to the end of the finish, and I gotta say, for a Märzen, this has an impressively long finish, and you get that nice crisp finish to it that's you know, it's maybe a little bit drier than the average Märzen, almost kind of Pilsner-like in the way that it finishes. It's got this crisp, dry finish, and you just taste that beautiful, nice, clean malt bill with that hoppy undertone without the intensity of the bitters. So it's just super clean, and it's super refreshing. This is a really, really well done Märzen. Honestly, it's pretty much exactly what I expect it to be, but you never know until you get it in your mouth, and I absolutely love it. I'm going to take my time sipping on this one, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get to our second beer. That is the Connecticut Valley Brewing Company's Oktoberfest Märzen style, slightly higher ABV at 5.8% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's Märzen or Oktoberfest style Tavour review. We've got Connecticut Valley Brewing Company's aptly named Oktoberfest. This one's slightly higher ABV than the first by 0.2, so it clocks in at 5.8%, and they are based out of South Windsor, Connecticut. So yet again, in terms of label art, kind of can design, They definitely went with a very much Oktoberfest theme here with some classic lederhosen, which literally means leather pants in German. But nonetheless, not much else to talk about. Let's get this cracked. Be the first beer I've ever had by this brewer, so I'm very excited. All right. Get this one poured in. Okay. Now, I'll be honest, this is much more akin to what I typically expect from an American interpretation of a Märzen. Deep kind of caramelly color, and typically has quite a bit of caramel malt in the mix, and it really accentuates the malt side versus the hop side. Not to say that you can't still have a hop forward and a nice bitter bite to more malt-laden Märzen. It's certainly possible. I've had some like that, but it's quite rare. Nonetheless, be it significantly darker than the beer you will get in Germany at the fest, this very much looks like a classic American interpretation of it. It's a very beautiful beer, nice clear. You can see the effervescence kind of working its way up the side. It's pretty active, formed a pretty nice creamy head here, so let's give it a sniff. It smells very nice. You can really smell the malt in there, but it definitely does have a nice little hop aroma to it as well. So we'll see how it turns out. Let's just jump right in this one and see how it is. That's a nice beer. That's very well done. So, hands down, this does have a much more deeply roasted, caramelly-like malt bill, and it does accentuate that side, but what I smelled on the aroma absolutely does come through in the beer. And in fact, comparative to the first, if anything, this beer's got a bit more of a bitter bite to it. They were not shy with the hops. They definitely put them in there, and it comes through in the beer. So you get this really nice, rich, full, malty backbone, and really it's more rich than it is sweet. It doesn't have a sweetness. Some do, some don't. This one's not sweet. It's just rich. It feels big. It feels heavy. It's got that nice kind of hop cleansing factor on the back end. It's really quite lovely. This is excellently, excellently balanced. I'm going to jump back in for body mouthfeel and explore this flavor development. Body on this one, I would say, it's kind of on the border between medium and medium heavy. It's got some real presence. And it's pushing 6% ABV, so I'm not surprised by that. In terms of mouthfeel, feels very much like a classic Oktoberfest or Märzen style beer, with the exception that this one gets super, super creamy when you agitate it around the palate. It gets really creamy, and it does thicken up the mouthfeel. They're not normally the thickest mouthfeel. They're not flat. There's a slight bit of thickness, but it's not a beer style you would term as viscous. Another thing about this beer, they're all a little bit different, but this one does not particularly have any kind of crisp, dry finish quality to it. It's very much wet from start to finish, and it doesn't really dry out. Even though it has that kind of cleansing hop effect on the back end of each sip, it doesn't have that dryness that can sometimes come with it, and indeed with this style. So it's quite a nice little treat here. This is an interesting kind of blend of the classic German way that they brew them, but with an American twist, and I think they pulled it off very, very well. I'm going to jump back in for one more sip for final thoughts. Yeah, it's so nice. Big malty up front, and it's rich malt. It's not sweet. There's a slight allusion to sweetness, but without ever presenting any real sweetness. And it's rich, nice roast, and it's not entirely caramel either. You might think that just by looking at the flavor. There's a good bit of caramel in the mix, but honestly, there's a nice roasty undertone to it, which is kind of an interesting twist, and it's quite nice. I think it works very well in this beer. And then the hops come through, and for sure, I would suspect that they're using a classic noble hop bill. It's nothing over the top. It's just a nice, classic, clean German bittering hop. Or Czech. They could have used Czech. I would presume German, but nonetheless, very nice beer. very clean. It's an excellent American interpretation of the Märzen style, and I'm a big fan. I think this one would really be enjoyable by beer drinkers with various different palates. If you like a hoppier side, it's still got that. If you like a maltier side, it's still got that, but without going to either end of the extreme. Kind of fits neatly in the middle. Very good beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with the Matchless Brewing Company's collaboration with Geaux. These pretzels are making me thirsty. Again, both of these are Märzen or Oktoberfest style beers, if you prefer. 5.6% ABV on this one. Matchless is based out of Tumwater, Washington State. So the aroma on this, quite nice, very much a classic Oktoberfest. Certainly more pronounced than average, but not top tier. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the taste, absolutely love this. I thought this was such a great American interpretation of what an actual classic German Oktoberfest beer is. The Märzen style is quite a bit lighter what they brew over there at the festival. It's a lighter beer. It's almost like a heavier Pilsner in a sense from the malt bill, but it's a lighter in terms of the hops, but it does still typically have a hop bite. That is how the bulk of them are brewed over there. This was a very, very close interpretation. It checked off a lot of the right boxes. I would have tweaked and added a little more hop bite, but it wasn't off by much. I gave it full points. I gave it a 10 out of 10. For the body, this was textbook Märzen. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same thing here. It's not a super viscous style. It's got a nice wet bit to it. It can have a little bit of a dryness, and this really checked off all the boxes again. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this was very much a classic Märzen. It's not a super long finish traditionally. It's a very clean beer. It's got a longer finish than your average Pilsner to be certain, but the finish itself isn't super duper long, and it does often have a slight dryness to it, much akin to a Pilsner. This one was very, very close. I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Head and retention. Did a really good job on this beer overall. Certainly well above average. They do tend to form heads traditionally. They get nice and foamy. This one did a pretty good job, and it held around for a while, but it wasn't top tier. It gets above average. It gets a 7. Appearance-wise, very, very close to an actual classic Märzen appearance. I did dock some points because they're never quite right, it seems, the American interpretations, but this was very close. I only docked 2. I gave it an 8 out of 10. For the balance I really enjoyed. I really thought that they nailed the malt bill in this one in terms of getting it very, very close to how the Germans brew this beer style. That said, it still could have used just a bit more hops. That was really the only thing I felt was off kilter, was kind of the hop content. It was very mild in terms of hops, just subtle bitters, but overall it was a well-balanced beer. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively, I really enjoyed it. I always love a Märzen style beer. I always enjoy trying the new American craft interpretations as well, because everybody seems to do them quite a bit differently, and they're all a little bit different. So kind of getting to go through and taste as many as I can is part of the fun of it. Really for me, I did enjoy it, but it just needed more hops. I docked 2 points there as well. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. This beer overall was very, very well done. This is a pretty close approximation to how the Germans do it. I only docked a few points in a few categories here. Overall, it was a very, very strong, well-made Märzen, honestly, for my money, in terms of coming close to how the Germans brew it. For me, it still just comes down to the hops. They do have a bit hoppier bite than what this produced. This was a delicious beer, make no mistake. It was just a little short on the bitters. It gets an 8 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Matchless Brewing Collaborative beer here with Geaux Brewing Company to 85 out of 100. So this is certainly well above average. Absolutely enjoyed it. And if you're a fan of the style, like a little more traditional bend, this is certainly one to keep your eyes out for. Moving on to beer number 2. This is Connecticut Valley Brewing Company's Oktoberfest, spelled with a K as it should be. This one's slightly higher ABV at 5.8%. and Connecticut Valley Brewing is based out of South Windsor, Connecticut. For the aroma, basically this one and this one were indistinguishable in terms of how it actually smelled and kind of the pungency of it. Admittedly, this one I thought visually, it's going to be more malty, but when I smelled it, it smelled like a proper German brewed Oktoberfest, so it does get a 7 out of 10. Taste-wise, the taste on this was very enjoyable. And in fact, in a lot of ways, I liked this beer better than this, just flavor comparison. This had a bit more hoppy bite. It did have more caramel malts in it, that was sure, though they didn't overpower. And it had this nice kind of roastier edge to it. Almost put me in mind of a brown ale, which is not traditional, though it was enjoyable. So it wasn't quite right for an actual Märzen, but I still really enjoyed it. I only docked 1 point, I gave it a 9. For the body, same as with the first for the same reasons, it gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Same thing with the mouthfeel, though it should be noted that this one was very much wet to the end. It didn't have that kind of classic dryness. They don't all have that, but it is very common. Just make that as a side note. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this one was not quite as good as on the first. It's not a super long finish for the beer style, and really for me, the finish was a bit more truncated than I expected, and in tandem with not having a nice crisp dry finish to truncate it, I was a little surprised because it was quite a bit heavier and so malt forward. It was still above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. Head and retention, this one did great. This formed a nice frothy foamy head and it had really good retention pretty much throughout the whole beer that I enjoyed. It gets a 10 out of 10. Appearance wise, this is where this beer really lost some points. This is just so much darker than a traditional Märzen that I have to dock them. And I try not to be too hard on the American craft interpretations, but I've got to judge based on the style objectively. They are not that dark. That is not how the beer style looks. I left it wholly average because there's so many like this. It's in high proliferation in America for what our craft brewers brew. But the appearance, it is what it is. So I'm trying not to be too harsh on them, but I still have to be objective. So we're going to call it average at a 5. For the balance on this beer was quite nice. In fact, it was quite a bit different than the first beer, the way that they pieced them together. But overall, it kind of came out to the same end result. Very well balanced. This was clearly malt forward, and the malts really came through rather tasting like more or less how a German would brew a Märzen, but it had some, albeit very enjoyable undertones. In a lot of ways, I could say I preferred it, but it's not quite traditional to the style. Those really roasty undertones, that is just not in them. And frankly, still on this one, it did have a little hoppy bite, but I would have liked a little bit bigger to cut through some more of that malt. It gets an 8 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Really enjoyed this beer as well. Had a lot of similarities between the two, and they definitely had their distinct differences. And I docked a few points here and there, but overall I thought they were both strong showings. This one also gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Really, it lost the most points here on appearance. Everything else was pretty strong, so very similar stories between these. Completely different approaches of the same beer style, but kind of the same end result. I mean, for all intents and purposes, if this were lighter and boosted the score up, they probably would have scored identical. As it were, it had 3 fewer points on appearance, and it ended up getting 3 fewer points overall. Example of the style, it gets an 8, and the total score on Connecticut Valley Brewing Company's Oktoberfest is an 82. So we're only looking at 3 points apart between the two beers, and they're both very similar, but where their differences were quite vast and quite striking. Honestly, if you're a fan of the Märzen style, I would recommend either of these beers because they were excellent, very enjoyable American craft interpretations. It's always fun to do these, and I always keep my eyes out for them this time of year. And I would encourage you to do the same. It's always worth it, and it's always fun to try new beers. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.